program design and evaluation. So I'm going to give you a warning at the front here. This is nobody's favorite lecture. It's going to mirror a lot your research methods class, which I know generally is not for many of you your favorite class. However, this probably is one of the most important lectures that we will have of the semester because A, it relates directly to your final assignment, but B, this is so much of what we're going to be talking about, and outcomes really depend on these key elements of our program design and evaluation. And so this skill is utilizable no matter what field you go in, but especially if you go into correctional treatment, program design and evaluation is so integral. So what does it mean? We're going to learn today what it means to design a program and also what it means to evaluate a program. So we're going to start first with program evaluation. So as with everything, we want to define what that is. So program evaluation is the use of social research methods to systematically investigate the effectiveness of intervention programs. So basically, we want to find out, using the research methods that you learn in your classes, does this program work? Is this program changing something? Is it making something better? Or is it making something worse? Or is there no change at all? We have to know that stuff in order that we can make appropriate decisions. And the goal of program evaluation is to improve programs and inform action aimed at ameliorating social problems. So, obviously working in the forensic environment, we are trying to diminish recidivism, decrease crime, and increase pro-social lifestyles for individuals who've been involved in the criminal justice system. So the programs that we are delivering, we want to make sure that those goals and objectives are being attained. So in order to do that, we have to evaluate. So what we're going to learn is, when we're doing an evaluation, there's a bunch of things that we have to think about. The first is, what are we trying to learn, and how is this going to lead to action? How can we help each other learn? Is this evaluation the right approach? And we're going to talk about different approaches. Who is going to do what, which is kind of key, and how are we going to communicate the results of our evaluations? So just to give you a brief history, evaluation research started back in the 1930s. If you recall, this is the time of the Great Depression. Resources were scarce, and so we had to know where we could put the few resources that we had that they would be most effective. So they started evaluating things. By the end of the 1950s, program evaluation, not in corrections, but in general, kind of with social welfare programs, became much more commonplace. This was now something that people did as part of the course. In the 1970s, evaluation became a distinct field where professionals learned how to do evaluation. In the 80s, we also kind of went into a bit of a recession, and so we started really looking at the costs and the benefits of programs, and that was also to get tough on crime. So we wanted to know, what are the social and the financial costs of the programs and what are the benefits? In the 90s, there was an economic boom. We had new social problems. And so program evaluation kind of grew. And now in the late 1990s and continuing on until today, we're starting to apply program evaluation in correctional settings. It's still shocking to me how many programs exist out there that are not being evaluated. Just people seem to think that you have a program that's good enough. But as we learned from the boot camps, some programs don't work, are costly, and can actually harm individuals. So, program evaluation needs to be done. So, program evaluation is going to continue, and it's expected to grow, especially within the correctional field, because more and more we're seeing budget cuts. So we have scarcer resources, and so we want to make sure that the resources we do have are being given to the most effective interventions. And so if you're thinking of looking for a job, this is a great field to get into because this is going to be a skill that's going to be very much needed in the future. Everybody is looking towards program evaluation. My husband is in the business field. They are constantly looking at data to see what works, what doesn't work, where they can kind of put all their eggs so that they get the most bang for the buck. So why should we evaluate? These are just some suggestions to see what we have achieved, to collect information, to criticize our own work, help us plan for the future, measure progress, make our work better, share experiences, to see if it costs too much, to compare our projects or our evaluate programs with others, to see what are the strengths and the benefits of our programs and the weaknesses, to improve our monitoring, to make sure that we are assessing things accurately, and to help us see where we're going and if we need to change that direction, which I think is so important because I think oftentimes, we develop something and we just kind of stick with it. And, things change over time. Societal problems change, people change. You might see drift. Initially you train some people to do something, but then they stop doing it the way you train them. So we have to monitor ourselves to make sure we are doing the best that we can and we're having the best outcomes that we can. So why evaluate a correctional program specifically? So these are kind of words that you may have learned in research methodology class. So we want to determine efficacy and we also want to determine effectiveness. So what are the differences between efficacy and effectiveness? Efficacy is kind of that ivory tower kind of, does it work, where you have ideal situations, you have, Ph.D. trained individuals being overseen by the developers of the program who are doing it, as part of a research study. In those situations, things are a lot more controlled and you can see if it works. Effectiveness means when you take those kind of gold standard programs that have been tested kind of in the laboratory, and now you're doing it out in the community with real life, people doing it, like people who are working in the field. Do those programs still work? If they do, that means it's effective. Is it feasible? I mean, I can develop the best programs ever with all the bells and the whistles, but it just might be too much, like with people having to be locked up at certain periods of time, people having to go for meals. It may not be feasible to have people in the room 8 hours a day. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is feasible for both the individuals who are taking the program, but also the people that are delivering the program. We have to determine if it's cost effective. So, we have a certain cost for incarcerating individuals. And so we want to show that our programs decrease the need for incarceration over longer periods of time and decrease the need for recidivism, which then will save people a lot of money. We also want to know that if we're developing something new, it's actually better than what already exists. So there's a lot of programs out there. It's nice to have a new program. People like new, shiny things. But if you remember, like New Coke didn't do so well because people like the old one better and it seemed to taste better. So new isn't necessarily better than old, but if new is improvement, then we want to replace it. We have to show that it is. So there are different domains that we do evaluations on. First is the need for a program. I use the example of when I worked in Canada, I was in the sex offender treatment program, and there was a woman who was developing sex offender treatment programs for female sex offenders. We'll talk about female sex offenders later on in the course, but in Canada at the time, it was a relatively rare occurrence that a female was incarcerated. So we had, in all of Canada, 10 females who were incarcerated for female sex offenses or for sex offending behavior. And she was spending, hours developing these programs for these 10 women. Rather than kind of using individual therapy, we were developing a whole program for these 10 women. So that might not be the best use of resources. The design of the program, how are we going to design and evaluate it? How is the program delivered and implemented? You want to make sure that the people that are giving it are properly trained and that you're doing it over the right amount of time. We want to see the outcomes of the program, and we also want to see that it's being as efficient as possible. So as I mentioned earlier, I can develop a program where I throw in everything in the kitchen sink, but the kitchen sink might not be necessary to affect change. It might not be part of the components. So what we do in psychology is called a dismantling study, where we look at the different parts of a program, and we try, if we have parts A, B, C, D, and E, we try to see if we get the same results with A, B, C, D, and then A, B, C, A, and D, to see which parts of the program are most effective. And if we can get the same effect for parts A and D that we would with A, B, C, D, and E, then there's no point in giving all those other modules, if that makes sense. There are some challenges that we encounter when doing program evaluation. There are changes in circumstances. For example, a prison might be locked down during the course of an evaluation. Or there may be a change in the politics. For example, there's a new head administrator who doesn't support this or has a different belief. You have to balance the need between science and pragmatism. So, I am somebody who works in the ivory tower. I want to have everything controlled as much as possible. In the real world, that's not always feasible. So we have to balance what is feasible to what is pragmatic. I was going to be doing a treatment outcome evaluation with a sex offender treatment clinic here in New York City, and I had talked about evaluating people every 2 months, and the director said, you know what, nobody's going to be completing evaluations every 2 months. That's just not feasible. How about let's make it twice a year? And so we changed that. And diversity perspectives and approaches. You're going to be working with a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, and people might have different ways of doing things, which can be sometimes frustrating, but sometimes I think diversity is an important thing, and looking at problems from different perspectives and from different stakeholders' points of views, I think is really important. So we want to tailor the evaluation. So we want to make sure that our evaluation is really going to be useful. So we want to provide feedback to program managers if we're doing an evaluation. We want to establish accountability of the decision makers. So we want to see, what's going on, who's responsible, and how decision makers can use that information to be accountable. And we want to contribute to knowledge. So, like the stuff that you're going to be reading here, we start to learn basically what works, what doesn't work. And so you can't just have one study, because we know from research that one study, statistically has a 5% chance of being an anomaly. And there also might be things with your sample, et cetera, et cetera. So the more studies that we have in our meta-analyses or examples of those, the better we can contribute to knowledge and learn what works and what doesn't work. We also have to accommodate different limitations, including funding. We're only going to have so much money that we can use to do this, so you have to make sure that you're able to complete your evaluation with the money that you need. The time for completion, so if your program is a year long, to spend 5 years evaluating that one-year program really doesn't make sense. You want to do it in a timely fashion so that you can provide timely feedback to the individuals. You want to make sure that the people who are doing the evaluation have the expertise needed. They have the background to understand what's going on and the skills to be able to do that. You want to make sure that you get buy-in from the stakeholders, because like if you are doing this against the will of the people who are involved, you're not going to get really good data or information. And you want to make sure that you have access to program records and materials. For example, if they're completing evaluations in the program, you want to have access to those. You want to have information about who the offenders are, because there might be things about the offenders themselves that impact treatment outcome. It might be that you're evaluating a certain type of offender at a certain risk level, at a certain age, of a certain ethnic background, and those things might come into play, as we'll talk about when we talk about diversity. So you want to have access to all that information. And so you want to balance, again, what is desirable with what is feasible. So when we're structuring the evaluation, there are three main issues that we want to address. The first is the question that the evaluation is to answer. So, those are the things like, is the program effective? Is it feasible? Is it cost effective? And we may be wanting to answer all of those questions, but you have to know exactly what your questions are. So if you remember from your research methods course, this is the problem that you're trying to solve. You then want to have the appropriate methods and procedures to be able to answer those questions. So, if the question is the program effective, you have to have some sort of pre-post measures. So something that you give them before the intervention, something you give them after, to see if there is change in the variables that you're evaluating. And you also have to know the nature of the evaluator-stakeholder relationship. So are you working for the people that have designed the program? Are you working collaboratively with them? Or are you being brought in to kind of take down this program because somebody says it's a waste of money, and so you're evaluating it to determine how good it is? And so are they going to help you, or are they going to be standing in your way? So you need to identify issues and formulate questions for your evaluation. And so you really have to spend a lot of time figuring out what it is that you want to ask. And you want to interview people before you develop your evaluation questions to understand really what is going on and how what they really want to know. Do they want to know, are my service providers doing a good job? Is this a good bang for the buck? Is this program working? Are the right offenders getting put into this program? Things like that. So you need to know what the research questions are. Then you're going to guide the design, so you're going to be able to provide meaningful information. So you're going to identify key factors or variables that will answer those questions that you're going to be focusing on. So the three basic questions that you're going to ask are, can the results of the evaluation influence the decisions about the program? So can the evaluation be done in time to be useful? So this is, again, the example where I gave you, like if it's 5 years later, that's no help to anybody. And is the program significant enough to merit evaluation? So if this is, something that's set up with like 3 offenders, and this is the only place in North America it's being done, to spend a lot of money and resources evaluating a program for 3 offenders might not be useful. But if this is kind of a statewide or a national program where you have lots of people going through, then definitely it's worthwhile evaluating. So some of the choices that you face as an evaluator are in terms of your design. So again, we get back to what are the evaluation questions? What are the comparisons that are needed? So do we have to have a control group? And you're going to be reading about this in your readings a little bit. What are the measurements that we're going to need? And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about design. And how is the information from this going to be used? So is this going to be used to improve the program, to chop funding to the program, to annihilate the program? So you want to know exactly when you go into this what the information is going to be used for. The other thing you want to know is what data are you going to have access to? So what are the primary data sources? As psychologists, those of you who've participated in the research experience pool know that we love to give questionnaires. So oftentimes our outcome measures are questionnaires. But we can also use behavioral data. So, reoffending is yes, we can look at records to see if they reoffended. We can give them drug tests. If they score positive, yes or no. We can look at institutional behavior. Did they have infractions? Do they have time in solitary confinement? Things like that. But they have to be relevant to the research questions that you're asking. So how should the data be collected? Is this going to be from file review? Is it going to be collected from the data themselves? Are the people who are giving the program going to collect it? Or are other people going to come in? Is sampling required? So if you have 10,000 people who are completing this program all across the United States, the chances are that you're going to get data from every single one of those people, that you're going to be able to travel and get all that data is probably nil. So what you want to do is to take a representative sample. So you may take 10 cases in New York, 10 cases in New Jersey, and gather that data. And how are you going to do that? You also need to do a power analysis. You probably learned about that in your statistical class, your stats class, to see how large a sample is needed to show that it works. For example, if you only have 2 people and one says yes and one says no, it's like 50-50, right? But that doesn't mean that that's representative of all the people in North America. It might be just that that's the 2 people that you chose. So you have to have a sample that's large enough that you can make conclusions about it. And how will we ensure that data quality is taking place? So how will we know that the data that we have is accurate and done well? Are people just like checking off any random answer, which none of you, I'm sure, ever did on your rep questionnaires. And we have statistical methods of ensuring that, but we also want to monitor people and making sure they're understanding and that they can read, et cetera, et cetera. When we are analyzing our data, we have to make sure that we are using the proper statistical techniques. So this goes back to your stats classes, that you're using the appropriate methods and how you're going to present the data. So, if you're presenting to a lay audience, if you're going to be presenting results of MANOVAs and ANOVAs and regression analyses, you're going to lose them right away. So you have to know who your audience is and how to present what you found. So graphs and pictorial depictions, even if you are, having an audience who is more informed, can always be helpful, because I think, people get lost in the numbers, as I'm sure you often do. We all do when we read results sections, as you're going to be reading in this class. So having graphs and tables really can help us visualize it, because a lot of us are visual learners. We also have to make sure that the results from our evaluation are being used. So we need to package that in a way that it's feasible and consumable. So when you read like annual reports, that's kind of what you'd be producing as an evaluator. You also want to know, should you have specific recommendations? Like when I do an evaluation of an offender, at the end of it, I make recommendations what I found to the treatment team based on what I found from psychological testing. So do they have difficulty reading? I recommend a recommendation would be like if they're reading at a grade 3 level, that any materials that are given to them are either reviewed with them or at a grade 3 reading level would be a recommendation, for example. And what mechanisms can be used to check on the implementation of these recommendations. So once you've had these recommendations, it's called closing the loop. You have to make sure that people then act on these recommendations, so you have to follow up and they have to provide you with a report of what they've done to act on your recommendations. So there are often problems in terms of evaluations. People who evaluate and the people who use the data often fail to agree on goals. For example, somebody who is really invested in their program might want to keep it open, and your goal is to show that it is not effective because that's what the data is showing. The program goals and objectives are found to be unrealistic given the resources. So somebody may want to have everybody evaluated, but they only have like $20 to do it. Obviously, it's not a real situation, but you're not going to be able to do it. So you have to kind of decide what's realistic. You need to have information, that in order to do your evaluation, and if you don't have adequate information or the relevant information, you're not going to be able to do your evaluation. And the administrators are unwilling or unable to change the program based on the evaluation. For example, you now have evaluation that seems like we have with the boot camps, for example, that show that these boot camps don't work and can be harmful. But, the evaluators say, you know what, it doesn't really matter because they cost less money, so we're not going to do anything anyway. We also want to see do an evaluation of usefulness. So if we find that the intervention is not useful, it shouldn't be continued, like our boot camps. But as you see, there are sometimes political and social forces, such as money, which is our next point, that can influence decisions. So even if it doesn't work and it causes harm potentially, there might be other reasons that they continued. Sex offender laws. I've written extensively about this and actually have written a book on it. Basically, do not work. Sex offender registries, sex offender civil commitment, things like that. They're very costly. They don't work. They actually increase sex offenders' risk for reoffending, but people want those laws and therefore they stay in place. And always keep in mind that program evaluation is a political activity, meaning that there's a lot of stakeholders that have a say in the matter, and the results might not be based on research, but actually on kind of, how is my constituency going to vote? Am I going to lose my job if I support this, even if it's, if it goes against even if it doesn't make sense? So this next section on program design is directly related to your final treatment program. So this first part is what's going to be happening in your literature review. So you want to do a literature review that shows why the program or intervention is needed. So you're going to look at the population that you're examining. You're going to find out the psychological characteristics of those people, the criminogenic needs that they have. You're going to find out what's done already with that population or something similar. For example, we may have female sex offenders, and there are very few, if any, programs for female sex offenders, but you want to do something for them. Here in America, there are more of them. And it's also with the times they've changed. And so, but there's no model. So what you might do is take what's being used for male offenders and adapt it for use with females by incorporating stuff that are specific needs for female offenders. You're going to identify the program's goals, the target population. So if you're going to say sex offenders, is it going to be child molesters? Is it going to be rapists? Is it going to be, incest offenders? And what are the desired outcomes? So do you want to decrease recidivism? Do you want to increase self-esteem? Do you want to decrease acting out behavior? Do you want to decrease time in solitary confinement? And how does your program use scientific knowledge and best practice of what works? So what are going to be the ways that you're going to evaluate these goals using the skills that you've learned in your research methods class? How does this new program fit with existing programs? So is it something that will be added on? Is it going to replace existing programs? Is it going to be done following it? Is it a maintenance program, for example? How are you going to carry out the program? So who's going to deliver it? Where will it take place? How many times a week will it happen? You're also going to look at how well the program was carried out. So, you're going to train your people. You're going to make sure that they are doing things the way they do. How did the program work? This is your outcome data, so these are your pre-post measures. And what can be done to improve the program for next time? So these are your recommendations. You also want to know how much your program is going to be costing. Who's going to train the people that are going to be doing the program? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be an expert in the field? Is there enough administrative support? Do the people in the institution support this program? Do you have people doing photocopies for you? How do the people who are involved in the program feel about it? Like a lot of times, people get very sick of new programs because they just learn one thing and now they have to do something else, and people really aren't that happy about it. But sometimes when something is new and exciting and you get buy-in from people, they can actually be really excited about participating. So a lot of this is how you sell it. So are the contents of the program valid? So that's where the research that you're going to be doing in your literature review come in, where you're going to look at what's been done, what's effective, what's not, and show that there's some research to support the methods that you're going to be used. And part number 6, are some parts of the program more effective than others? And that's where you're going to have maybe the dismantling study. So there are some things that we need to do, some things we don't need to do, or do we need all parts of the program? So in your introduction, your 5-part literature review, you're going to need to know what's done in the past. Generally, for the literature review, you're not talking about your facility, but let's say you're going to a new place. You want to know how they've been doing things before you start changing things. But in general, you want to know what's being done in the field. And that's where, doing your research is so important. Why do people need that program? Who's supportive of the program? Who's not supportive of the program? Because that's the kind of the political infrastructure, and you have to know how difficult it's going to be, because the more impediments you have to implementing this program, the harder it's going to be. You then want to determine your target population. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to be specific. So if you want to do a program for somebody who has drug crimes, are you going to do somebody who has an addiction problem, or are you going to be doing somebody that's selling the drugs? Are you going to be looking at, everybody, adolescents and adults, or only adolescents? And if only adolescents, is it going to be from a specific age? Because 12-year-olds are very different than 18-year-olds. So what you do is you conduct your literature review. You're going to do that using PsycInfo. You're also going to look at your theoretical perspective, which likely, if you've been reading your lecture notes, will be cognitive behavioral. You want to figure out what behaviors you want to target. So do you want to target, anger? Do you want to target sexual violence? Do you want to target domestic abuse? Do you want to target substance abuse? And you want to make sure that the factors that you're targeting are related to recidivism in the population. So you're not going to be targeting hair design among sex offenders, because that's completely unrelated, or grooming potentially, which may or may not be related. So when we're developing our design, we have different types of research. First is descriptive, where you kind of just talk about what's going on. It's not really what we use so much to evaluate programs. You can do correlational. So where you have uncontrolled samples, meaning that you have the relationship between two things. You can have quasi-experimental, which is probably what most of our studies are going to involve, where we do some sort of pre-post design, where we're looking at before and after the intervention. Did those things change? Or you also might have a control group which receives the intervention or doesn't receive the intervention. Or you may have a waitlist control. An experimental design is almost impossible in a correctional setting, because then you have to do a randomized controlled trial where you're randomly assigning people, and that's kind of unethical. It might be that you can randomly assign them to waitlist control or to the intervention, where the people in the waitlist would eventually get the intervention, but it cannot be a true experimental design where somebody doesn't get it. So in experimental designs, you have random assignment, which is often not feasible, as I mentioned, in correctional environments. The quasi-experimental design is usually what you're going to be using, where you have, waitlist control groups, or people who wouldn't have got the intervention anyway, because not everybody gets it. A lot of the research that we do is uncontrolled, where we just do one group and we don't even have a control group, but that limits our ability to say that it was our program that made it better, because people can change with time. It may have nothing to do with our program. So it's only by having some sort of control group that, if we can compare the uncontrolled to the control group, and there is a difference, that we can make some conclusions about our program. But we always have to work within what's feasible, and in a correctional environment, there's not a lot feasible in terms of research design. Then we need to know the type of analyses that we're going to be using. Most generally, you guys are going to be using pre-post design, so you're looking at things before and after the intervention. We also want to see if we can predict recidivism by certain factors, and that can help us understand what's related to them. Measurement is so important. This is what we're going to use to assess whether our programs are effective or not. So we often give questionnaires, so we're going to be looking at some thoughts or behaviors, and we're going to be measuring that. You're generally using questionnaires, but then literacy can come into play, or if people don't speak the language, or they don't have functional literacy, meaning in the grade 5 language. You can do clinician interviews, but that, if you have a large program, takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money. You want to look at static. If you remember, those are the unchangeable factors like age and gender, versus dynamic factors like, substance abuse or anger, things that can change. We also want to make sure that the measures that we use are reliable and valid. They have psychometric properties, which you learned about also in your research methods class, because a lot of the measures that we have in corrections have not been assessed for their psychometric properties. So we're not even sure oftentimes if the measures that we're giving actually measure what we say they're measuring, which is a problem. We will then consider when we're going to administer our assessments. Is it going to be before the intervention, in the middle, and then afterwards? Is there going to be some sort of follow-up? And if so, how long? 6 months, 1 year, 5 years? I mean, obviously, the longer that we can go out, the better we can make conclusions about our program. You know, sexual recidivism, a lot of it happens within the first 6 months, so maybe doing a year follow-up may be sufficient to make some conclusions about our program. And we want to do ongoing quality control because you often see what's called drift. So you develop and design the program, and then with time people kind of drift away from the original. So you want to make sure that you're periodically checking in on the quality of the program delivery. One of the things that you're going to be doing as part of your assignment is writing one session of a treatment manual where you're going to tell people what they're going to do, or at least outline for people what they're going to do. I strongly recommend writing a manual because otherwise, if it's not written down, people will not do it. I've seen manuals that are completely scripted. I don't necessarily recommend that because I think people need to have flexibility. So it's more like a lesson plan than a script. And also if they're scripts, I've seen people doing them, they actually stand there and read, which is incredibly boring. You have to decide how many sessions, and a lot of that is going to be based on your literature review for, you know, how long the program has to be for a certain level of risk. You're going to determine what factors you're going to target. So, you know, like if you know for sex offenders, things like loneliness and guilt and trauma are related to reoffending, those are the factors that you're going to be targeting in your treatment program, and you're going to be addressing those with psychological methods. When you're writing your treatment manual, who's going to be your audience? Is it going to be the service providers? Is it going to be the administrators, or is it going to be an offender manual? Because sometimes these programs have therapist manuals and offender manuals, so they can do homework exercises, things like that. And is this something that's going to be implemented only in your kind of facility or jurisdiction, or is this something that's going to be nationally implemented or on a state or regional level? Because the more dissemination you have, the more you have to be able to have consistency, and so the stronger your manual has to be. When you structure your session, usually most correctional programs are done in groups. That's for cost purposes, but there's also the whole dynamic of the group and how people work together, which can be beneficial because you often have people calling each other out, kind of helpfully though, on their criminogenic thinking, for example. You can also have psychoeducational groups where you're teaching them about skills like HIV awareness, things like that, and they can participate in group activities, and I think the group can be used as a model for change. People may also, depending on the need, have individual sessions, especially if there are more mental health needs, and you're going to give people homework, like between session activities, so they can practice the skills that you're learning in group. You're going to have to figure out how many service providers you're going to need. You know, are you going to have multiple people? How are you going to do it? Because most facilities are male only, so you're going to have a female and a male working together, et cetera, and how is that dynamic going to work? You also want to know how many sessions you're going to have per day, per week, how far apart they are, for how long. And then you have to choose your service providers. Who are they going to be? Are they going to be social workers? Are they going to be psychologists? How are they going to be trained? How, you know, are you going to give additional training to what they've already had, or are you just going to give them the training manual and expect them to learn? And how willing are these people to learn a new program? As I said, oftentimes people come in with this like great new program and people, you know, just don't want to take the time to learn anymore. So if there's incentives involved for people, either that they get learn new skills, which is often incentive enough, or they get paid extra, things like that, people might be more willing to take on a new program. And you know, what are the attitudes of the place where you're working? I mean, the more support people have, as we talked about in our previous lecture, the better willing they're going to be to kind of continue on, that learning is kind of part of their lifestyle. And what is the turnover within your facility? If there's high degree of turnover, that's going to impact service provision because, you know, there's not going to be a lot of continuity of care. People are going to have to learn things over and over again, so that's going to affect it. You also have to make sure that you're doing training. So who will be doing the training? How are you going to train them? Is it going to be a one-day training? Is this ongoing? Who's going to train the trainers? So is there going to be like you who developed the program who then trains the trainers, who then train the service providers? And then you want to also monitor what's going on, and this is part of our quality control. We can have people videotape their sessions, and you can have people periodically review the videotapes, or you can do in vivo, meaning you actually sit in or watch through a two-way mirror to make sure that people are adhering. You're going to have some scale to make sure that they're adhering to the certain things that you want them to. So in terms of our outcome evaluations, we have direct effectiveness measures, so those are going to be our questionnaires, our recidivism rates. They're also indirect measures, kind of like client satisfaction. So the offenders might say, you know, how much they liked or didn't like the program. The administrators might, as well as the service providers. You know, you're going to look at social validity. Is the treatment wanted? But you're also going to look at the costs and benefits of the program. So there are multiple components